Je vais juste dire quelques mots au sujet de l'Institut des sciences cognitives. Donc, l'Institut des sciences cognitives co-organise cet événement avec le département de philosophie. Donc, Paul va donner aussi une conférence demain au département de philosophie sur l'intelligence artificielle. Donc, does ChatGPT, is it good or evil, or something like that? Look, so for tomorrow, we'll have that talk if you want to attend. So it's about the ethics of AI. Tomorrow at the Department of Philosophy in the 2 o'clock. Also, is it 3? I'm sorry, yeah. It's at 3 o'clock. Yeah.
One at philosophy.
Are you sure? Yeah. Okay.
I'm almost sure.
Okay. But I think they're usually at 3. Yeah. Donc
yes, usually they're at 3 in the afternoon.
Yeah, right. So, comme c'est la fin de la session, so je switch en anglais maintenant. So as basically the end of the semester, our activities are winding down. We have the talk today. We have the last Midi AI. Donc c'est a new workshop on artificial intelligence. We've been having those for the whole year since October. The next one would be on agentive AI. So are those really agents, or it's just a buzzword or whatever? So we'll discuss the nature of those kinds of AI that are starting to come up. So that's going to be on the 30th, April the 30th at 12:45 on Zoom. You can check on our website. At the end, so the way we're going to work today, we'll have our talk, we'll have the Q&A, and then after that, if some people want to stay, we have coffee, we have cookies and stuff. If people want to stay and continue discussing with Professor Thagard on either the subject of this conference or more generally on cognitive science. This is something we try to do at our talks at the Cognitive Science Institute to help students and faculty interact with our speakers, and then afterwards we'll leave for dinner. And if some of you want to come with us, you are welcome. So without further ado, I'll let Serge do a proper presentation.
Okay, well, good afternoon. Well, I think I know Paul since years and years ago. We're of the same generation, so we met at our first meetings at the Canadian Philosophical Association. I would say around 1980 or so.
At least that's only 1 century away.
Well, Paul Thagard is Professor Emeritus at the University of Waterloo, Ontario. He has a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Toronto under the supervision of our friend, philosopher Bas van Fraassen, an old friend of ours. He also has an MSc in computer science from the University of Michigan. He has received many recognitions for his work, like a Canada Council Killam Prize, which is very prestigious, and he is a member of the Royal Society of Canada. He is specialized in the philosophy of mind, in the philosophy of science, and in cognitive science, including its relations to neuroscience and computer science. Paul Thagard is one of the most influential cognitive scientists. He has contributed to so many topics, among others, perception, analogical reasoning, abduction, induction, scientific explanation, decision-making, pseudoscience, conceptual change, creativity, emotion, false news, misinformation, the nature of mind, and more recently, the nature of consciousness, that he will talk to us about what he'll talk to us today. He has also enumerate all his publications, would be very long. I won't do that, but I would like to recall only some of his most important books in chronological order. First, Induction, Processes of Inference, Learning, and Discovery. Computational Philosophy of Science, then in 92, Conceptual Revolutions. After that, the book that I love, Mental Leaps, Analogy, and Creative Thought. Then Mind, an Introduction to Cognitive Science. In 1999, How Scientists Explain Disease. Then the Cognitive Science of Science, Explanation, Discovery, and Conceptual Change. Then brain-mind, from neurons to consciousness and creativity. After that, more recently, bots and beasts, what make machines, animals, and people smart. And the last one, Falsehoods Fly. Paul is a good friend of UCAR. He has participated in many of our summer schools. I would say as many times as our friend Daniel Dennett, who died last year. And in the one I organized in 2016 on human reasoning, the registered students at that time, in order to earn their credits, had to choose 5 lectures out of the 50 lectures we had, and to write some short critical papers on those lectures. And Paul's presentation, and I was not surprised, was the most chosen one among all the lectures. And so for our next summer school in 2026, you can make sure that I will invite him once again, hoping that he will be available once again. Today, Paul will talk about his upcoming book that will be available this summer at Oxford University Press, called Dreams, Jokes, and Songs, How Brains Build Consciousness, and it is the title of his talk today. The advertising of the book says it proposes a new, clear, scientifically plausible theory of consciousness based on brain mechanisms. It explains how consciousness works in important aspects of human lives, including dreaming, humor, music, religion, sports, and romantic chemistry. It compares human consciousness with what occurs in animals and machines. So our Institut des Sciences Cognitives is honored and very pleased to welcome our friend and colleague, Paul Thagard.
At the end of the talk, we'll be giving away Paul's last book, and Paul has agreed to sign it for the winner. So one of you here will have a draw at the end of the talk. So let's wait around.
That's great. I've never been a door prize before. Well, it's wonderful to be back in Montreal and back at UQAM. I've had a wonderful time at the Cognitive Science Summer Schools. Really wonderful enterprise that you put on here. And the last time was actually during the pandemic, so I did it virtually, but this is more fun. So I'm talking about consciousness today. There's a recent review that lists more than 100 different theories of consciousness that are out there in philosophy and psychology and neuroscience. And so why do we need another one? Well, basically because the others aren't very good. But the question is why is such an important topic? I think that consciousness is one of the most challenging and fascinating problems in all of science and philosophy. It's right up there with the origin of the universe, the existence of dark matter, and whether there's intelligent life on TikTok. So these are all some of the biggest challenges we have. So people keep coming back to that. So I've got this new theory, and I don't have time to give you all the reasons for it, but I'll give you 3 of the best, because among other things, it can explain 3 fascinating aspects of human thinking: dreaming, humor, and music, as well as lots of others. So I'm going to use them as my main examples today. So I'll give you the outline. Worked before. How do I get it to advance? Okay, all right, the mouse works fine.
Either or.
Okay, good.
You can't do anything without an institute.
All right, okay, it's the right button. Okay, so here's an outline of my talk. I'm going to say something in general about what I think conscious experience is and why it requires explanation. And the way I'm going to explain it is by a kind of theory, which is ubiquitous in science and very relevant in this case, which is in terms of mechanisms, and particularly in terms of neural mechanisms. So my central claim is that all the aspects of consciousness that are important can be explained by 4 neural mechanisms, which are neural representation, that is how brains can represent things in the world; binding, which is how brains can put representations together; coherence, which is making sense of things in a quite rigorous way; and competition, which is when the representations start fighting it out for each other. And I'll show how all 4 of these apply to dreams, jokes, and songs. They apply to a lot of other things as well, but definitely there. the crucial idea for how this can all be put together is an idea of emergence, which I'll explain. Emergence is sometimes treated as something that's kind of mystical or magical, but it's not. It's actually permeates science. And I'll show how this works for, if I have time, works for explaining timing as well, because timing is a really important part of consciousness. Finally, as a kind of bonus, I'm going to throw in my new solution to the mind-body problem. Because when I was working on this, in conjunction with another book, which is about the new AI models, I realized that if you combine this theory with the new AI models, you get a new solution to the mind-body problem that I think is quite promising. Okay, it's interesting. Okay, so what's the problem? What do we got to explain? Well, there's some people don't think it's a problem. Behaviorists said, well, consciousness, we don't have to deal with that. That's not scientific. But I think it's something that we're all familiar with. And these are the 4 different kinds of experiences we have. Last night, I had the great pleasure of seeing my son, Dan, play at a concert. And so I was thinking about the kinds of consciousness that are going on there. So there's lots of external perceptions. So we could see his band play and I could hear them. I couldn't smell them, which is probably good. But we know that there's all these external perceptions, a big part of it. But there's also conscious experience of internal sensation. If you're hungry or in pain, or if you're feeling wobbly because you've got vertigo, these are all also conscious experiences. And of course, among the most important kinds of consciousness are emotions, such as happiness. There are hundreds of different kinds of emotions. There's the really good ones like happiness, joy, and excitement, and pride, and also the really bad ones like shame and pain and suffering, and sadness and fear. So that's a huge part of human life. And these are all very much tied in with our bodies, but we also have very abstract ones that are not so connected with our bodies. So up here at the corner, I've got one of my favorite kinds of cheeses called Taleggio. It's an Italian cheese. It's got great smell and taste and makes me happy. But I can also have abstractions. I can have another abstraction, which is Italian and cheese, and combine that into Italian cheese. And so, probably if people in philosophy have a lot more of these conscious abstract thoughts than normal people, but everybody, if you're involved in religion or mathematics, we can be consciously aware of abstractions as too. So any decent theory of consciousness has to be able to explain what goes on in all these cases. Some philosophers like to say that the problem of consciousness is to say what it's like to have consciousness, but that I think is a mistake. There's not one thing that it's like to have consciousness. There's millions of things that are like. So you've got to be able to explain all 5 kinds of external perceptions, all 12 kinds of internal sensations, all several hundred kinds of emotions, and the unlimited number of abstract thoughts. So if you're going to have a theory of consciousness, it's got to handle all of those. So what's a theory? Well, some people think a theory is just a story, and a lot of things that pass for theories, even in cognitive science, are just stories. But I don't think that's very good, and that's not very easy to evaluate or compare against other ones. In fields like physics and economics, theories tend to be mathematical. You have sets of equations, and this has been extremely successful in lots of areas of mathematics. But it doesn't work so well in fields like biology and cognitive science and psychology. And there, lots of philosophers of science have pointed out that what people typically do when they explain something is to present mechanisms. So you all know what a mechanism is. You all know what a bicycle is. It's got parts like the wheels and the handlebars. And you know that if you move the wheels, it moves the chain. So you've got a bunch of parts that interact with each other, and then it has a regular result. The bicycle goes down. Even simpler mechanism is scissors. It's only got 3 parts, but if you move it, you can cut things with it. So this idea of mechanism has been extremely productive in science. There are millions of citations of that. A simple kind of gear here is an example. And of course, these aren't incompatible, because if you have a really good description of your mechanism, that is, if you've described the parts and how they interact, and then you give a mathematical description of it, then you should be able to give a really rigorous, exact idea of what the mechanism is. And in fact, what you can do, and the way cognitive science has been working ever since the 60s, or the 50s actually, is if you can you have a mathematical description of your mechanisms, then you can turn it into a computer program. And you can then run the computer program as a simulation to see whether the system behaves the way you think it does. And one of the great things about that is sometimes it fails. You learn a lot from your failures as well as from your successes. So what I'm looking for consciousness isn't just a story. I'm looking for a mathematically describable set of mechanisms which can be simulated and then behave like those organisms that are having conscious experiences. It doesn't mean that the computer program has conscious experiences, but you can simulate behavior. Okay, so here's my theory. I call it the NBC theory because it's short and snappy. I don't think you'll confuse me with the American Television Network or the National Bank of Canada. So NBC is short for neural representation, binding, coherence, and competition. And so the idea is if we've got these four mechanisms, we should be able to explain everything about consciousness, including perception, sensation, emotion, abstraction I talked about. And then I introduced a word here called zing. I'm going to be talking about dreaming shortly, and people say that dreams are a source of creativity. Well, I've been tracking, ever since I started this project 3 or 4 years ago, I've been tracking my dreams, and I've only had one creative one in all 3 years. And it actually was, I got the idea of using zing to summarize all the things which are supposed to be characteristics of consciousness. They're private. I have my consciousness, you have yours. It's something internal to us. It's qualitative. There are qualities to it. It's subjective. I can't see your consciousness. It's something I'm aware of. And then this sort of mushy idea of what it's like. So I'm going to call that all zing. So my basic claim here is that zing is the result of interactions of these four mechanisms. So when you've got one mechanism operating, like a bicycle, you've got the different parts interacting to have a result, such as allowing you to go down the road. But when you get a bunch of mechanisms interacting, then you can get something even more complicated. So our bodies are like that. We've got a bunch of mechanisms in our body. We've got our lungs and respiration. We've got our heart, blood circulation. We've got our brains, got our immune system. And these are all different mechanisms. And when they interact in a good way, that's how we get health as an emergent property. Okay, so let's start with neural representation. This is extremely well understood. Here's a drawing by Cajal from way back from the 19th century. And he was one of the first to realize that we could understand how the brain works, how our mind works by identifying these particular cells that were later named neurons and seeing the ways in which they're connected and the way in which they interact. And it's really important that we have neural representation here because there's a lot of different kinds of neural representations. You've got 86 billion neurons, and they can fire in different patterns. And this incredible diversity of patterns is what explains our incredible diversity of experiences, including everything that goes on at a musical concert or a talk or eating a good meal and so on. So I think the idea of neural representation is well understood and well accepted. So what are the applications? Well, up here in the corner is a cartoon from my analogy book. And I've always loved this because it's a completely nonverbal joke, but it's also an analogy. So I was worried that maybe this doesn't work anymore. So I asked somebody who's got little kids, well, do they still have projectors? Because I didn't know, and they do actually. And so probably when you were a little kid, I don't know how to do this anymore. You'd make little pictures and you had, and what I liked about this, of course, is that it reverses it. So it gives you the opposite. So how is this going to go? We need to be able to have a way of representing how that's going on in our brains. And you can do that in detail for the 3 main examples I'm talking about today. So for dreams, how do dreams work? That's actually really quite well understood. The function of dreams is very controversial. I actually don't think dreams have any function at all. But the mechanism in which they work is really well understood. When you go to sleep, you get very strange patterns of firing in your brain. Why is that? What's going on? Well, sleep is really valuable to people and other organisms. If you don't have sleep, you get sick and deranged. But one of the functions of sleep is memory consolidation. So when you're sleeping, the experiences you've had during the day that have been recorded in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, it basically sort of sums it up. But then the brain makes a really interesting decision. What happened today that was important enough to go into permanent memory. The permanent memory is in a part of the brain called the cortex. So memory consolidation is this kind of rehearsal. And so the hippocampus starts rehearsing things and interacting with all the other parts of the brain, all the other memory. And as a result of that rehearsal, it's sort of getting trained to figure out what goes into permanent memory in the cortex, and that becomes your long-term memory. So I think there's good reason to believe that dreams happen during this process, but basically as a side effect. Okay, so that's the way the representations work with dreams. What's going on with jokes? Well, here, if you found that amusing, it's amusing because there's a shift in interpretation. That is, you've got to have a representation of the old thing that you learned in school, people making strange figures, but then here the rabbit. So you have to have a different representation of it. Similarly for songs, in a wonderful concert I heard last night, there's all sorts of auditory representations, visual representations. I could sort of imagine Dan playing his instrument, which has mallets. You call them mallets? Yeah. So you've got all sorts of other kinds of representations that are an important part of music as well. So this is to show that, yes, it seems that if you want to explain dreams, jokes, and songs, neural representation is an important part of that. But by itself, that doesn't explain very much. The second part that I think is really important is binding. So this idea has been familiar in perceptual theory for a long time, going back to Anne Treisman. It's the idea that you can't just have the representations that are the basic ones that you get from direct contact with the world. You need to be able to put them together into more complicated ones. So here I've got Taylor Swift wearing a red shirt. So if you take shirt and red and put them together, then you get a kind of representation. So how does the brain do this? Well, there are two good theories of this. And I don't think they're actually competing theories. I think it's quite possible that they're both true and that there are probably other ways that the brain does binding as well. So one is the synchrony theory. So suppose this is, imagine this hand is neurons firing, and this is a bunch of other neurons firing in these two representations. So if this is red and this is shirt, and they get firing at the same time, then that would be a way in which they would be bound together by synchrony. And I think that's part of the way binding works, but there's another theory. It's a little more mathematically complicated, but I'll give a metaphorical description. It's a matter of convolution. If red and shirt are both firing, and you can kind of twist them together. Mathematically, this can be explained in terms of vectors operations, but here just sort of think of them as being twisted together. And this is really valuable because if you are doing a kind of permanent binding rather than something that's just temporary, like red shirt. If you really want to be able to talk about the concept of red shirts, then the convolution view is really well. So we've got mathematical computational mechanisms for binding that operates in very mundane things like red shirt, but it's also crucial to creativity. So there's an old theory of creativity, hundreds of years old, that people just asserted, which is that creativity is just taking ideas that are previously unconnected and putting them together. But I was shocked to learn that no one's ever actually looked for evidence for this. So I did a project where I looked at 100 examples of scientific discovery and 100 examples of technological invention and showed that every one of them involves binding of concepts, conceptual combination. So this is a very mundane sort of thing when you just see a red shirt, but it's also something that's the source of all creativity. So how does this apply? Well, binding is really important in all of the areas I talked about. So what goes on in dreams? Well, you're having lots of bindings, sometimes very strange ones. So in this picture here, I've got the sort of cloudiness that's associated with dreams and the pillows, but there you've got a pillow with clouds. Why is that like dreaming? Well, it's I think, an appropriate conceptual combination. So why are dreams sometimes so weird? A week or two ago, I had a dream about Pierre Poilievre running for leadership of the Conservative Party. And what he was doing in the dream is that he had black garbage bags in which he was trying to catch rats. And he had actually succeeded. He actually had a whole bag full of rats. Well, I think this is really silly, but why did it come about? Well, because I'm following the Canadian election, and so I'm hearing about it constantly. And garbage bags, well, I use that to take out my garbage. Why the rats? Well,
maybe not that silly.
What's that?
Maybe not that silly.
Okay. Okay. Well, and the reason I've been thinking about rats is because I'm about to tell you a joke about rats. I was rehearsing that. So basically, my dream, because dreams are strange because you're not constrained by external experiences, because it's basically your memories, short-term memories and your long-term memories, and the things are becoming active together, and you just get these strange bindings. So the bizarreness of dreams, which many people have remarked upon, is a result of binding. So I bound together Pierre Poliev with rats with garbage bags, and that was the result there. Okay, so jokes. So I guess now I owe you a joke. I was trying to think of a cognitive science joke. So here's one. Have you heard that psychologists no longer use rats in their experiments? Instead, they use lawyers. And there are 3 reasons why they use lawyers. First of all, there are now more lawyers than rats. Secondly, the experimenters found that they were getting attached to the rats. And third, there were some things that the rats wouldn't do. Okay. This is actually a joke with a sequel. The sequel is, well, but the psychologist had to stop using the lawyers in their experiments because the results didn't transfer to humans. Okay, so why is this funny? Well, I haven't got to the full story yet because you need all of the mechanisms to explain why that's funny. But certainly you need binding here because you've got psychologists using lawyers in the experiments. So in order to create that complex of representations, you need to have a representation of lawyers. That might be verbal or it might be visual if you've got a visual picture, but then you have to bind it together into something more complicated. Songs. Well, this was really great last night. Aside from Dan's wonderful Greek band, I saw a Congolese band. I'd never heard Congolese music before, and it was just amazing. It was rhythms I hadn't heard before and melodies I hadn't heard before, kinds of dancing I hadn't seen before, a fabulous singer. But nevertheless, it all fit together into a really nice whole because the singer's voice bound beautifully with the percussion instruments that were involved, and even though I couldn't understand Congolese, she did a little French, which I could follow to some extent. But basically, it just bound together a whole bunch of things in a quite terrific way. Same with Dan's band playing the Greek instruments. But crucial idea here, and this is, I think, absolutely key to the power of human thinking, is that binding is recursive. That is, you can get bindings of bindings of bindings. One of the most plausible accounts I've heard of how humans got really smart, and it's relatively recent, it's only about 100,000 years ago, how the brain somehow mutated to be capable of these kinds of recursive bindings that made possible art and music and language, which then, of course, made possible mathematics and science and philosophy, all these other powerful things. So the idea of binding is really crucial. But here's the great thing, because we've got at least 2 good mechanisms for binding. We've got both the synchrony and the convolution one. Both are very well understood mathematically. We've got binding as a biologically plausible and theoretically well understood mechanism. That's an important part of our consciousness. Couldn't do it by itself because you got to have the representations first before you get the binding, and it's a big part of it. But it's still only part of the story. Okay. Now, I started working on this a few years ago after I read a book by Anil Seth, one of the theories of consciousness that's been influential. And I read the book and I thought, hey, he got a lot of attention. He got reviewed in newspapers as well as academic stuff. And I thought, this is an absolutely horrible theory of consciousness. I can do better than that. But then I thought, well, if I'm going to make this good, I should be able to do stuff that people haven't tried to apply theories of consciousness before. And that's where I thought, well, let's take 2 things that are really hard, dreams and jokes. And so I reviewed the literature on dreaming and jokes, and it suddenly struck me that there was a key aspect missing in both of those. And that aspect was coherence. Now, coherence, in the way I use it, isn't just a metaphor. Philosophers since Hegel have talked about coherence as a kind of holding together or fitting together or hanging together, something that's like consistency, but a little bit more. But it's a very vague story. Lots of reasons to think it's an important idea, but probably the best I ever did in my very long career, idea I ever got in my very long career, was that coherence doesn't have to be just a story. It can be a mechanism. And the kind of mechanism that's involved here is called constraint satisfaction. So here's a good example. How many of you have seen The Old Woman, Young Woman? So you can make it switch back and forth. If you look at the chin, you'll see that as the young woman. If you look at that as a nose, looks like the old woman. All these Gestalt phenomena can be understood as coherence that can computationally be analyzed in terms of constraint satisfaction. So there are different constraints here. There are things that fit together. So example, if you see this is the nose and you see this is the chin. So these are the things that fit together. But there are also things that don't fit together. And so if you can make it flip back and forth, it's because there are constraints of things that are incompatible. So this can't be both a nose and a chin. So you got to be able to see how it fits together. Well, what I showed, this is way back in 1989, is that these ideas of coherence can be translated into networks of constraint satisfaction that can be modeled by neural networks, modeled computationally. And just large numbers of applications to this, to science and law and medicine, social psychology ever since then. So that's what I think coherence is. But what I realized way back when I started doing this a few years ago is that dreams and jokes both really need coherence as a crucial part of it. Because what's going on in dreams, I guess that's the next slide. Yeah, that's the next slide. So I'm actually not the first person to try to have a common or connected theory of dreams and jokes. Freud did that more than 100 years ago. Unfortunately, he had a bad theory of dreams and a bad theory of jokes. That didn't work. But as far as I can tell, I'm the first person since then to try to come up with a common theory of dreams and jokes. And coherence is a key part of it. Because what I think the brain is doing while you're sleeping and when you're doing memory consolidation, when it's trying to reconcile your experiences of the day with your whole lifetime set of experiences, it's trying to come up with a coherent picture of that. And that's why it gets so bizarre, because it's trying to think, well, Polyev, rats, garbage bags. Well, how do I put that together? Now, oh, Polyev is trying to capture rats in the various. So you're trying, it's a coherence engine. I think the brain in general is a coherence engine. It's trying to make sense of things in this objective sense of constraint satisfaction. So that's what's going on there. The brain is coming up with these attempts at coherence pictures, but it's sometimes just not very good at it because it doesn't have the kinds of external input that we get from our awake times. So another metaphor here is making a puzzle. So you can think of coherence as a kind of puzzle where some things fit together, other things don't fit together, and you got to put it all together so it works. Well, the same thing happens in jokes, but it's a little more complicated. What happens in jokes is you have one coherent interpretation, such as psychologists doing experiments with rats, but then you get a different experience, a different interpretation, such as the psychologists doing experiments with lawyers. So you know a lot about rats and you know about lawyers, but it's really hard to put them together. And what you get is a kind of shift. So you get a shift from one interpretation to another interpretation. And the shift is always cognitive. So I challenge you to take your favorite joke. It may not be the same as my favorite joke. People have different senses of humor. But take your favorite joke, and I bet you will find, first of all, they always involve a shift in cognitive coherence, a bunch of ideas that fit together to another set of ideas that fit together. But this is not universal, but it's common. You also get a shift in emotional coherence, where you've got one emotional interpretation that shifts to another. So I don't think this is universal. If you look back at that hand joke that I had there, it's purely visual. I don't think there's actually an emotional shift there. But a lot of jokes are about very delicate things. They're about sex or violence or conflict. And so in those cases, you usually have one emotion set up, and then that can transfer over into, or gets transformed into something that's a different emotion, has a different kind of emotional coherence. So I won't go into my theory of emotional coherence. That's all well worked out as well. But every kind of humor I've looked at, even something as basic as slapstick. So I'm not going to amuse you by walking along and falling down. And you wouldn't be cruel enough to laugh anyway. But if you're watching a movie, you do that. So what you've got things that looks like a normal motion, but then someone slips on a banana peel. Well, it's a shift in emotions. So coherence is a really important part of jokes as well. For music, well, coherence is also very important because the French folk singer who started the Dance Greek band or the Congolese band, they were all really, really great, but it wouldn't have worked if they had been coherent, if they hadn't fit together, if the harmonies and the melodies and the instruments, the lyrics and the dancing, if they were discordant, if it was all over the place, then it wouldn't have been nearly as effective as a musical performance. But when music works, and it often does, it's a matter of this kind of coherence. So this is to try to show that lots of people have talked about consciousness in terms of neural representations, and a few people have noticed the importance of binding. But here, I'm trying to make the case that you also have to have a very rich mechanism of coherence in order to explain what goes on. Okay, one more mechanism. This was actually back in my original 2014 theory of consciousness, and I still think it's absolutely crucial, even though most theories don't have it. Human consciousness is very limited. We can only think about a few things at once. I mean, right now, I hope you're thinking about my talk, but I can guarantee you if that door burst open and a bunch of zombies walked in, your consciousness would switch there. That's a matter of competition. So psychologists have written about this a lot, mostly under the heading of attention. Attention is limited. You've probably heard of the cocktail phenomenon where you're at a party and you're talking with somebody, you think you're paying attention to them, but over there you hear somebody mention your name. Then your attention will flip over there. So this is well understood, but it can also be well understood computationally. I did a model of this back more than a decade ago, where you've got different neural representations. So one is speaker and another is zombie. But what will happen if the zombie suddenly arrives, then the competition goes on between the representations. Zombie will obviously win out, and then your attention shifts. So this is really important part as well. And you can see that going on in all the applications. One of the interesting things about dreams that undercuts claims that they're supposed to be functional is we don't remember most of our dreams. If you wake people up in the night, you'll find that they often have 10 or 12 dreams a night. So we have a lot of dreams. In the morning, so I usually remember at most one or two. So we don't remember most. And why do I even remember those? Well, it's because they outcompete the alternative sorts of representations. So I think what you remember with your dreams is a matter of what's stronger. Where does strength come from? I think it's from emotion. It's because that you've got dreams that are emotionally salient to you, and therefore they can outcompete all the other things that you just sort of flush when you wake up. Similarly, competition is important for jokes, because a joke for it work, it has to be able to switch between the different interpretations, but one has to outcompete the other. So if I told you about psychologists using rats and you're just thinking about psychologists using rats, and you never switch to thinking about psychologists using lawyers, that nothing would happen. But you have to have one interpretation set up and then a competition that makes sense enough that you can switch to the other one. Similarly, in music, I'm not a musician like my son and his friend Zoe, but music's really important to me. I listen to it about 8 hours a day, all the time that I'm writing, all the time that I'm reading. And it kind of goes in and out of consciousness. When I'm really working on something intently, I'm not really paying attention too much to the music, but I like to have it there. But the music will go in and out, again, depending on its emotional effect. So competition is a really important part of dreams, jokes, and songs. Okay, so this puts it all together. So this is the overall mechanism. It's a set of mechanisms, just the way that life is a set of all the mechanisms that operate in your body. So we've got neural representation, and which does a lot of amazing things. I haven't talked about modal retention, but this is an idea that comes out of Chris Eliasmith's idea of neural representation. It's an idea that when you have your sensory experiences, and they become neurally represented and bound together, it retains the characteristic of the inputs that came in. So it's a highly embodied system. So it depends very much what kind of things you saw or what kinds of things you heard or smelled or touched or taste. And then the representations retain some of the characteristics of the initial patterns of firing that went into it. So modal retention does that. Timing, I'll get to shortly. The binding, we've seen how binding is really powerful because it produces the compounds that you need for music and dreams and jokes. Coherence is constraint satisfaction, where it's doing this complicated computation of what fits and what doesn't. Competition, you get different kinds of interpretations, different kinds of attention. And so these are the emergent properties of all of the initial mechanisms. And then here's where it gets kind of fuzzy. You get patterns of neural activity you didn't have before. And that's where I think consciousness comes from. It comes here because you've got all of these things combining their own kinds of emergence into something that's really rich and powerful. And that's where conscious experience comes from. But I really owe you an account of emergence, because this is sometimes taken as a sort of mysterious notion. It's not mysterious at all. It's found in all areas of science. It's found in sports. So the Canadians, I gather, aren't having a particularly great year this year. But if you follow sports at all, you know that sports isn't just a matter of having the best players. You can have a bunch of good players, but if they don't play as a team, they're not going to be very effective. It's also true of research groups in science or humanities. So for any kind of team, you need to have the parts, but you also have to have them working together in very good ways. And when you do that, you get a result that's not just the sum of the parts, because it results from the interaction of the parts. This is not my idea. Lots of people have proposed it. Mario Bunge was a philosopher in Montreal, had the idea, but so did dozens of other people. And there's some recent books on complexity theory that shows that this operates everywhere. So I basically just extracted this from literally a dozen people who've described emergence. And they're right. I think this is just a really important idea. There's absolutely nothing mysterious here. It's something that pervades physical systems that have any complexity. The simplest example I can give you is water. Water is H2O, but water is a liquid at room temperature. Unlike hydrogen and oxygen, which make it up. Hydrogen and oxygen are both gases at room temperature, but you put them together, you bind them together, and you end up with something which has the emergency property of actually being liquid. Life is a more extreme, where many different mechanisms go together. Orchestras are like that as well. So you might have the 5 best musicians in the world, and if they're each trying to go their own way as part of a band, it's not going to be a very good band. People have to be in sync. Emergence is an absolutely crucial idea here, but so is an idea of recurring emergence, which is that you get all mechanisms operating, producing emergent properties, but then you get all the mechanisms interacting, and then you get. So I think it's one of the reasons why consciousness seems so mysterious, because it's not just emergence, it's emergence from emergence, what I call recurring emergence. So it's a very complicated idea, but I think it's starting to yield to scientific understanding. Okay, how am I doing for time? What?
Yes, 15 minutes.
Okay, got 15 minutes, good, that'll be perfect. So when I was working on this and I got to music, I suddenly realized I'm missing something. There's something really important I'm missing. I'm missing time, because you can't understand music without time. It's crucial the way the band has to work together and unfold. And I thought, do I need another mechanism? Do I need a 5th mechanism? Fortunately, it turns out no, because if you take my 4 mechanisms and combine it with some really new ideas in experimental and theoretical neuroscience, you can get a theory of time consciousness that solves all sorts of puzzles. For more than 100 years, philosophers and psychologists have been puzzled about things like, well, how can there be before and after? Or how can there be present and past? So philosophers have, like William James and other people have sort of tied themselves up in knots. Edmund Husserl tried really hard to make sense of this. He couldn't do it. I think if you take the ideas about neural representations I've described and combine it with two really recent ideas. The first idea comes from experimental neuroscience called time cells. So you might have heard of place cells. This goes back much longer, a couple of decades, where people who were doing recording of brains of rats discovered that they have place cells. That is, they have neurons, cells that fire differently depending on where the rat is. So if a rat is in one place, we've got some neurons firing, it moves to a different place. And it's really important because it's how rats get a permanent memory of their location. I haven't thought of this before. I don't think the research has been done. We'll probably get a grant to do a study of time cells and grid cells in lawyers. It's probably worth investigating, but it's probably the same thing. How do they know whether they're in the office rather than in the bar? Well, it's going to be because they've got the grid cells. But the time cells are much more recent. This is only in the last decade or so, where there are neurons in the brain that fire basically where you are in a sequence. So if you want to keep track of walking from here to here, there's some neurons that are firing at the beginning of the sequence, later sequence. So this is a really neat idea, but doesn't really say how it works. Well, my colleague at Waterloo, Chris Eliasmith, is one of the leading figures in theoretical neuroscience as well as philosophy of mind, has figured out how this works. It's an idea he's developed called memory units. He's got a whole bunch of papers on this, a psych review paper that's just about to be published, where you can work out mathematically how, in connection with time cells, different neurons can keep track of what time you are in a sequence. And this is obviously really crucial for music, that you can play music with other people. It's really crucial for dreams. I mean, dreams, it doesn't work very well because you don't have the external inputs. And so dreams are weird because you can jump from one time to another really easily because it's not constrained, but still you're using time cells. And jokes, the timing is really crucial. Dan's here, so I know you know knock-knock jokes, so let's do it. Knock-knock. There. Interrupting cow. Moo. Okay, so I interrupted of it, so it's a joke that depended on timing, and there's others like. Okay, so I already mentioned these applications. Yeah, so timing is fundamental to dreams, jokes, and songs, and everything else. Obviously, it's important for sports. You can't do passing, you can't do plays. It's crucial for religious experiences, another thing I talk about. It's crucial for romantic chemistry, which I also have a theory of, because if your timing is off, things won't work. So timing is an important part of consciousness, but the beautiful thing is that if you've got the four mechanisms I talked about, if you've got neural representation and binding and competition and coherence, and you connect it up with these new findings in neuroscience involving the time cells and Elias-Smith's memory units, it all gets explained. So this is only a small part of it. I mentioned other applications to other emotions and so on. I'm basically just giving you my theory today. It's axiomatic in science that you don't just believe the first theory that comes along. You got to show that you're better than all the alternative theories. And I've got a chapter that does that. I also talk about animal consciousness because I think that animals are conscious. I used to think that animals were conscious down to the level of mammals and birds. Recent work's convinced me that it probably goes down to bees and crabs. Now, there are some people called panpsychists who believe that everything is conscious, including the desks and atoms and rocks. Well, I can give you lots of reasons why that's not a good theory. A big issue right now is whether this extends to machines. So tomorrow I'm talking about ChatGPT and other new artificial intelligence models, and some people claim that they're already conscious. And I think the answer, no, I don't think that's true. But all that requires much more argument. So let me finish off in an even more grandiose fashion with a solution to the mind-body problem. This is an ancient problem, goes back at least to ancient Greeks and ancient Indian philosophy. It was debated as well around the same time. What's the relation between mind and body? It seems really puzzling how these amazing mental experiences we have all the time, our perceptions, our sensations, our emotions, and our abstract thoughts could come out of a hunk of meat, 3 pounds of flesh. Well, the traditional views like dualism, I don't think are very plausible. In fact, most people are dualists. There are 8 billion people in the world. 4 billion of them at least believe in an afterlife because they're Christians or Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists who believe in the afterlife. If you believe in the afterlife, then my theory has to be wrong because my theory says it's brain mechanisms. Once the brain is gone, then consciousness is gone too. And it's sort of appealing to, I think, the idea that you could be conscious forever, but I don't think that's going to work. Panpsychism has problems as well. So from a materialist point of view, there's been 2 primary theories of how the mind and body are related. The one that I've always liked, actually, is the mind-brain identity theory that says all mental processes are brain processes. And in previous books, I basically plumped for that. I thought that sounds right. But I always said, well, there's a kind of caution here because what would happen if we got real AI? That is, what if we got artificial intelligence that really does seem to have maybe not the conscious experiences that people have, but has some of the things like inference and language use and analogy? Well, the big shock happened in November 2022 when ChatGPT came out. And in 2021, I published a book called Bots and Beasts in which I said, well, we're probably decades or centuries away from real AI. Oh, I've never been so wrong so fast. Because as soon as I started playing with ChatGPT, I realized it can do a lot of really impressive things that we treat of as mental operations. And it's become even more so since. So I'll evaluate a lot of those tomorrow. So suddenly we've got generative AI. And so that makes mind-brain identity theory look iffy because it looks like there are new entities that can do a lot of things that sound like thinking, like making inferences and using language. But I didn't swing to the other theory that's been around. So this is an idea that goes back really to the 18th century. But in the 1960s, an alternative idea came along that really has dominated philosophy for decades. It goes under different names. It's sometimes called functionalism, because the idea is that it's not the hardware that matters, it's actually the functions. You get various inputs, you get different outputs, and anything that could have those functions, like any computer. So functionalism was inspired by the development of computers in the 1960s. It looked like they were doing a kind of thinking. So the claim is that, well, hardware doesn't really matter, because if you take the software that you've got, Microsoft Word or an operating system, it can run on lots of different kinds of computers. So this was the argument, was that, oh, intelligence should be multiply realizable in different ways. And so forget about the mind-brain identity. Well, I was never convinced with this, because way back in the 80s, I realized that parallel computing really did matter. Having a bunch of computing going at once gives you big speed advantages. And then in 2022, I published a paper that said, well, it's not just speed, it's also energy. And so the brain is just incredibly energy efficient. And that's really crucial for our ability to survive in the world. If you don't have a lot of good energy use, if you can't get energy to fuel the operations, then you're not going to last very long. So energy is important. Space is also important. That is, it's a question of how can you operate in a real space. And so you have to be able to carry your head around. And even more important for humans, it's got to be born. It's got to fit through the birth canal. So space really matters. So there's all these constraints. So what's going on is that this doesn't work because now we've got generative AI. But then when I started looking in detail at how the new generative AI systems, I realized that they are also highly constraint dependent. So a key part of what's made the new AI work is new generations of chips. This actually started with gaming. A couple of decades back, the builders of gaming systems realized that they had to do a lot of computation very fast, but they don't have to do all kinds of computation. A classic computer does all kinds of computation. They figured out if you used graphics programming units, you could do just the kind of computation that was really useful for gaming. And those became very successful. And then only about 15 years ago, some researchers in deep learning, powerful kind of machine learning, realized that the kinds of computations that were used in their deep learning algorithms were just the kinds of things that the GPUs, the graphics processing units, did really well. So it's not an accident that all of these AI systems are using special chips, either the NVIDIA chips, which are the most successful ones. Suddenly NVIDIA leaped up to be the most successful company in the world for a little while, but also very similar kinds of chips that are done by Amazon and Google. There actually are not just special purpose computers, they're not just universal computers, they're special purpose used for speed, for keeping energy costs down. One of the big problems is, of course, they generate a huge amount of heat, and you have to use energy such as water or air to reduce the heat. So the lesson from generative AI is not the functionalist idea that hardware doesn't matter. Hardware matters a lot. Okay, so this then gets put together into my solution, which is that hardware really does matter, but not nearly as narrowly as mind-brain identity suggests. You can have various kinds of hardware-software combinations, but they're tightly constrained. They're constrained by time, because you have to be able to operate in real time. Space, you can't be too big, but you also can't be too small. If you're too small, you're not going to be able to act in the world or do things. Energy, you can't use up more energy than you can acquire, but also history, because all these things are tied in with where they came from. That's most obvious in biological evolution. Not everything can evolve, because it can only evolve from organisms that are already around. But the same thing true is technology. You can't just sort of say, oh, let's have a quantum computer. Well, we haven't figured out how to make quantum computers yet, so you're constrained by history. So the general conclusion here is that only some hardware-software configurations are going to work. So the general conclusion here is there doesn't have to be just one thing that's conscious, namely brains, or one thing that can do inference or language, but there's not going to be a lot. So the mind-brain identity theory says, well, there can be only one kind of intelligent being. And the functionalist says, well, anything could be intelligent. Here, no, it's going to be a matter of scarcity. So I call this position coherent materialism. But I'm using the word coherent not in a vague notion of making sense. It's in the quite precise notion of constraint satisfaction, that only a couple of really nice combinations of hardware and software are going to be able to produce intelligence and consciousness and all these other things. So we've already got one great example, namely brains that have evolved in humans and other animals, and another one seems to be on the run. I don't think actually that the AI models are conscious now, but they definitely seem to me to have very powerful kinds of inference and natural language and other sorts of reasoning abilities. So this is my new solution to the mind-body problem. So let me wrap up. Claimed that all aspects of consciousness, and I've only given you a few examples today, can be explained scientifically using 4 brain mechanisms. Mechanistic explanation, you get the idea of what the parts are, that is the neurons and the neural representations, to put them together, and we can explain consciousness. I've said that one by themselves, they can't do it. Neural representation alone doesn't get you consciousness. You also need binding and coherence. When you put them all together, then you get consciousness as an emergent property. There's lots more work to be done with this. A lot of this has been modeled computationally. I've had computational models of coherence, as well as independent of emotion, of the sensory competition, and so on. But I've never actually put them together into one large model, because at this stage of my career, I'm happier writing books than writing computer programs. But that could be done. And various experimental tests can be done as well. But if you can buy into that picture, and if you see the additional insight that when we look at the new kind of intelligence that's come on the scene, namely the generative AI models, and realize that they really are surprisingly dependent on the kind of hardware they're working with, then you can see that there's a pointer toward a new kind of explanation of the mind-body problem, namely what I've called coherent materialism. Thank you.